Friends, good friends all, as Daniel Marsh would greet if he were among us. I'm honored to be here for a brief moment and to offer a word of opening and quiet meditation. I'm Bob Hill, the Dean of Marsh Chapel here at Boston University, and have had the privilege of working with the deans here, starting with Dean Henderson, Dean Sapiro, Dean Cudd, and Dean Sclaroff, and have met our other guests too. And it's a happy, happy moment. And they asked if we would just pause for a moment. I'm going to offer, in the spirit of Howard Thurman, a section of his favorite Psalm 139, and then a pause in brief prayer. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest when I sit down and when I rise up. Thou discernest my thoughts from afar. Thou searchest out my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou dost beset me behind and before, and layest thine hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and travel to the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thy hand shall lead me, thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, let only the darkness cover me and the light about me be as night, even the darkness is not dark to thee. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with thee. And we pray. Grant us thy peace. Grant us thy peace. Grant us thy peace. Amen.
Thank you, Dean Hill, for also invoking those luminaries of the university, Daniel Marsh, Howard Thurman. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our very first signature event of Alumni Weekend. This event where we welcome former as well as current deans of arts and sciences in a retrospective discussion of their work here at this college. So this Alumni Weekend, we're celebrating, as you might imagine, our present accomplishments, to be sure. We're also celebrating our future aspirations. But this morning, we want to take a brief pause, just for a second, and reflect on our past. And specifically, as by way of introduction to our panelists, I would like to provide everyone with a very, very brief glimpse of the truly exceptional history of arts and sciences here at Boston University. So in fact, try to imagine what it was like 150 years ago. Back then, when Boston University was being chartered, there were approximately 500 institutions of higher education across the United States. Of those 500 schools, two and only two, Harvard and Yale, had comprehensive programs across law, theology, medicine, and the liberal arts. That is until Boston University. None of those 500 schools, however, had advanced research programs like one would find across the Atlantic in Germany. And almost none of those 500 institutions would admit women equally to all of the very same programs that they did with their male students. And almost none of those 500 programs admitted African Americans equally to all of the very same programs as their white students. But the founders of Boston University and their supporters were very, very different. They were comprised of both men and women who were members of a very tight-knit community of Methodists and abolitionists. And they elbowed their way into Boston right alongside Boston Brahmins and Unitarians and Irish Catholics. And they hungered for change, and they had these high ideals. Ideals such as racial integration, religious freedom, women's empowerment, global outreach, the collegiate tradition of promoting virtue and piety, and the more modern trend of offering both a liberal arts education on one hand with a professional schooling on the other hand. Now, in the beginning, Boston University had graduate professional programs in theology, law, music, and medicine. But President Warren still hungered for what he thought were the two crowning departments. Specifically, what he hungered for was an undergraduate program of liberal arts and a graduate school of sciences. And early on, it appeared that Boston University had all the momentum it needed to add those two crowning departments. After all, it had a new home in Boston, one of America's busiest and most historic cities. It had a great visionary for its first president. It had the financial support of three wealthy Boston businessmen. In fact, it also had the bequest, $1.75 million from Isaac Rich, that immediately propelled the university to one of the most heavily endowed in the country. And it had a progressive mission to educate all people, regardless of race, regardless of social class, regardless of gender, and regardless of religious creed. So BU seemed perfectly positioned and had all the momentum, that is, until November 9th, 1872, when the Great Boston Fire ripped through the commercial district of Boston and gutted the university's endowment, which had been locked away in real estate assets across the district. Virtually overnight, Boston University was nearly bankrupt. Its momentum had been extinguished, and its dream of having these two crowning departments had nearly been lost too. Meanwhile, other well-endowed institutions like Stanford, Chicago, Johns Hopkins leapfrogged over Boston University in terms of reputation. But of course, like most origin stories, we eventually find out that with just pennies in their pockets, but this grand dream in their hearts, the trustees essentially took a leap of faith. And in March of 1873, they voted to establish a College of Liberal Arts. Now, there was no guarantee that the trustees' venture would actually succeed, but in September of that year, 22 undergraduate students showed up to a dark townhouse in Beacon Hill, which still stands across the State House today. And there, they were met by just four full-time faculty members. So right off the start, that faculty-student ratio was off the charts. Those original students were remarkable for so many reasons. For starters, they included both men and women. After all, Boston University was committed to coeducation from the very start, and it would still be another century before our Ivy League cousins would do the same. The students were also remarkable because they hailed from lower middle-class backgrounds all across New England, and they commuted to campus each and every day, not by plane, not by car, but by way of horse-drawn streetcars. In their very first year, some students took a working lunch, bussing tables at nearby restaurants to help pay their way, specifically that high cost of tuition, which was, are you ready for this? $60. Now, for that kind of money, the students had a few obligations. First and foremost, they had to attend daily chapel services. So Dean Hill, I imagine, to be even busier back then. They also had to take required courses in classical history, rhetoric, and mathematics, and they took not one, not two, not three, but 4 required language courses: Greek, Latin, German, and French, all before their junior year. And yet some students apparently still felt they needed more language study, so they decided to elect to take Sanskrit, of all things. During that first year, Sarah Emerson, who you see pictured here, became the very first woman to stand and give the traditional recitation of Latin in class. And if you think about it for a second, that must have been a truly remarkable first word. She would go on to earn a PhD from Yale and teach at Wellesley College. Ava Channing, granddaughter of the eminent Unitarian minister and abolitionist William Ellery Channing, distinguished herself as a writer and activist and helped to pave the way for the 19th Amendment and the universal right of women to vote. Soon, the new Graduate School of All Sciences advanced its first 2 PhD students in 1877. One of those 2 students was none other than Helen McGill, the very first woman in the world to earn a PhD. That's still years before the famed Johns Hopkins University graduated its first class of all male PhD students. And not long after, John Wesley Edward Bowen, a freed slave from Louisiana, attended BU, studied the philosophy of personalism under famed Professor Borden Parker Bowen, and became the very first person born into slavery to earn a PhD in 1887. That's nearly a decade before W.E.B. Du Bois would earn his doctorate from Harvard. That original cohort of 22 students that you still see pictured here eventually graduated with their degrees, but they also graduated with relationships that would last a lifetime. And despite all that set them apart and made them different, despite all the years that would pass and despite all the miles that would come between them, they still found time to gather with one another. In fact, here's a photo of the surviving members of that very first class at their alumni weekend for their 50th class anniversary. So if this doesn't touch your heart, I don't know what will. Some of the earliest faculty, as well as the students, the faculty were also notable. There was James Geddes, for instance, a polyglot professor teaching French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and the science of phonetics. Judson Cloyt, a professor of mathematics and astronomy, would take his students out onto Boston Common to use a Pei telescope to see the solar system. And there was also Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, a Reconstruction-era writer who was the very first woman to teach at BU's College of Liberal Arts in that very first year of 1873. After all, in the words of President Warren, quote, "BU welcomes women not only to the bench of the pupil, but also to the chair of the professor." And then there was Borden Parker Bowen, who at the age of 29 became the very first chair of philosophy. He became a prominent philosopher, a theologian, and a progenitor of an influential school of thought later dubbed Boston personalism. Of course, Professor Bowen would teach his students, disciple them actually in this school of thought, including the eminent Edgar S. Brightman, who would return to Boston to teach, who in turn also discipled a Harold DeWolf, who stayed at Boston to teach, who in turn would disciple a young black Baptist student from Georgia named Martin Luther King Jr. Now, during these early years, the college quickly outgrew its cramped quarters on Beacon Street, and in 1882 it moved into a renovated church around the corner on Somerset Street. By 1907, its significant growth compelled yet another move, this time to 688 Boylston Street in Copley Square. And at the time, the growth of the student enrollment so worried the president that he fretted that the college might have to serve up to 1,000 students 100 years down the road. Of course, today you all know that we stand at 11,000 undergraduate and graduate students. And finally, in the late 1940s, the college relocated once and for all to its current home here on the Charles River campus, a brand new home. And in a promotion for that move, it read, quote, "The plan is ready. All young men and women, whether rich or poor, of whatever race, creed, or color, shall have their chance." Somewhere, that original group of misfit Methodists, with their high ideals for starting this university, you have to imagine that somewhere they were smiling. And finally, to our point today, there were also the deans. John W. Lindsay, a professor of Roman literature, was the very first to lead the college, followed soon thereafter by William E. Huntington, a professor of ethics and history, and renowned for his generosity, his compassion, and his gentleness as a dean, became the second. He also went on to become the second president of the university. William Marshall Warren, son of President Warren, entered BU at the age of 17, as you see here, but he didn't leave for another 50 years, earning his bachelor's, his master's, his PhD, teaching on the faculty, and then serving for an astonishing 33 consecutive years as dean. After Dean Warren, much would impact the college. The financial hopes of the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, where student enrollments tanked by 35%, World War II, where nearly half the population wore military uniforms across these halls. In the 1950s, there was a surge of federally sponsored research. In the 1960s, the student protest movements, and sadly, the shootings at Kent State University. And so that brings us to the 1970s and our very first guest. Stephen Joel Trachtenberg was chosen by then-President John Silber to serve as dean of the college and later as vice president for the university. Dean Trachtenberg went on to serve as president for the University of Hartford for 11 years, and then as president for the George Washington University for nearly 2 decades. He has served as special assistant to the U.S. Education Commissioner, and he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And of course, in all his spare time, he also managed to publish 7 books and co-edit 2 others. In 1988, then-President Silber appointed Dennis Berkey as the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. But apparently that wasn't enough, so he also made him University Provost at the exact same time. Dean Berkey served on the faculty at BU for 30 years, publishing in the field of applied mathematics and authoring several widely used textbooks in calculus. He went on to serve for 9 years as the president of Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He served on numerous boards, including the Massachusetts High Technology Council, the U.S. Competitive Council, UMass Memorial Healthcare, and the Massachusetts Education and Finance Authority. Jeffrey Henderson is the William Goodwin Aurelio Professor of Greek Language and Literature Emeritus. In 2002, then-President John Wessling appointed Dean Henderson as the Dean of Arts and Sciences. Years prior, Dean Henderson held professorships at Yale, Michigan, and the University of Southern California. Dean Henderson is known for his pioneering work on Greek drama and politics, and for editing and translating 2 ancient Greek novels and the Socratic works of Xenophon. He's held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation as well. He has also served as the president of the Society for Classical Studies. Gina Sapiro is Professor Emerita of Political Science. In 2007, President Bob Brown appointed Dean Sapiro as Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences after her many years of teaching and administrative work at the University of Wisconsin. Dean Sapiro became the first woman to occupy this office, finally bringing the college full circle to its original groundbreaking roots. Dean Sapiro has published extensively in the fields of political psychology, political behavior and public opinion, gender politics, and feminist and democratic theory. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2002, and her work has been recognized with the Harold Lasswell Award and the Frank J. Goodenow Award. Gina would have loved to have been here today, but she is traveling abroad at the moment. Ann Cudd became the Dean of Arts and Sciences in 2015, after nearly 30 years at the University of Kansas, including as their Vice President and Dean of Undergraduate Studies. Dean Cudd's research spans social and political philosophy, philosophy of economics, feminist theory, and philosophy of social science. In 2018, she went on to serve as the Senior Vice Chancellor and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and just this past month began her new post as President of Portland State University. And now you know why Ann cannot join us this morning. Since 2019, Stan Sclaroff has been our current Dean of Arts and Sciences at Boston University. He joined the Arts and Sciences faculty in 1995, served as the chair of the Department of Computer Science, and also served as the Associate Dean of the Faculty for Mathematical and Computational Sciences. Dean Sclaroff is a globally respected scholar in the areas of machine learning and artificial intelligence. He is also an elected fellow of an Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and the International Association for Pattern Recognition. And moderating our panel today is our very own Ariane Chernak, Professor of History, Scholar of Modern British and European History, and Associate Dean of the Faculty for the Social Sciences. She is also a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Honorary Research Associate at the Center for Modern Monarch. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dean Chernak and our former and current deans of Boston University's College of Arts and Sciences.
Well, thank you, Dean Healy, for those incredibly informative remarks, the history, the potted history lesson that we just received. As a historian, that really tapped into everything I care about at this university. I think that we have a remarkable history, and it inspires and motivates me, certainly, to continue that work that Dean Healy laid out, so thank you. And thank you to all the panelists who are up here on stage. Some have come from quite far to be here with us today to engage in this reflection on where we've been and where we are going. The way that this discussion will be organized, as you just heard, Deans Cudd and Sapiro can't be here, sadly. So we will be folding some video from footage I did with them over the summer into our conversation today. And we'll try to do it in as organic a way as possible. So we are going to begin this morning by thinking about what drew all of you to the position of Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'd like to begin with some footage from Dean Sapiro and Dean Cudd. What drew you to this position, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences?
I didn't start out at the age of 5 thinking someday I want to be Dean of a College of Arts and Sciences. This place was exciting, especially exciting, because it was on the move and it needed to change. And when Bob Brown sweet-talked me, picked me up at the airport, and we talked, he said he needed somebody who could manage some real change in the place, improve the quality, change the culture. And I thought, well, that sounds fun, because I never wanted to do leadership just to manage. That's not me. I wanted to make a difference.
Well, I was very excited about the idea of joining CAS, in part because it's in Boston. I was eager to move to an urban area, and of course, Boston is such a great city. Then when I looked at the faculty of CAS, I was so impressed. There were so many great faculty, and that was a big draw. I would also say BU had this great history of a philosophy of science that I knew about in advance and was also really attractive to me.
Okay, so we've heard a little bit there from Dean Sapiro and Cudd. Now I want to hear from the four of you. What were the differences that you wanted to make? What changes drew you to this position?
Some of you may remember when the College of Liberal Arts was called CLA. And you may be curious to know what was wrong with that name and why was it changed to Arts and Sciences. So John Silver comes to Boston University from the University of Texas, and he comes to give a talk to the faculty of CLA. And during the proceedings, he makes several references to the college as A&S, which is what it was called at the University of Texas. And on the way back to Bay State Road, he said, "How'd it go?" I said, "Oh, John, you were fine. Good talk, except every time you said A&S, our faculty, who referred to it as CLA, you could see that they heard that you were a guy just off the boat. And weren't quite sure what the name of the place was where you had arrived." So he said, "Oh, that's a good point." He says, "If I ever come back to give another talk," he says, "remind me before I go up so I don't make the same mistake." I said, "Sure." Don't you know, a couple of weeks later, he comes back to say something, and I remind him. And he goes on, and he gets it right the first time, CLA. He gets it right, but then as he's talking, he's thinking, he's going, he keeps referring to A&S. So it's over, and we're walking back, and he says, "How'd it go this time?" I said, "Well, it went fine, but you made the same mistake." He said, "Damn it." He said, "Change the name." So I did. So it's amusing to me to come back and see everybody referring to A&S and to remember John's inability to master that significant piece of data. I think A&S is the more common usage in the United States, so it's probably not a terrible thing. What was the question?
What drew you to this job? We have someone who wanted to change names.
Yes, I had just been fired by Richard Nixon. I had been serving as the assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Education. And Nixon got elected, and naturally all the political appointees were dismissed. And I got a letter saying that I was out of work and decided to go out and have lunch and have a drink. Forgive me, I know it's a Methodist institution, but under the circumstances. So I'm in the elevator, and I have this letter, and there's a guy standing next to me, and he's got the letter, and the two of us are standing there with our letters, and I say, I see you got the letter. And he says, yes. I said, let me buy you a drink. So we go to lunch together. This is Calvin Lee, and he says to me, so what are you going to do now? I said, funny you should ask, I'm looking for a job. And he said, well, I just got one this morning. He said, I'm going to go become dean at Boston University at CLA. He said, I happen to be looking for an associate dean. So I said, assistant dean, I think he started, but we negotiated. I said, I don't know anything about higher education. I don't know anything about education at all, as a matter of fact. He said, oh, that won't be a problem. He said, you're a smart guy, you'll figure it out on the job. So I negotiated with him, and I knew enough to bump it up from assistant to associate dean and to ask for an associate professorship. And I remember he said, I can't give you tenure. And I said, I'm only 22, or, I don't know, 24, 6. What do I need tenure for? So he said, good. So I came here as an associate dean, an associate professor, and watched other people struggle all their careers. You know, they move up the ladder of academic success, and thought what a remarkably fortunate opportunity I had lucked into. I arrived in those days, well, even now I have a beard, but in those days I had a beard and blue jeans, and I became known as the wolf in sheep's clothing by the undergraduates who were then publishing the BU News. I got here in time for the Vietnam War and sort of served as an intermediary between the quote-unquote administration and the undergraduates. I think I probably got enough stories to keep the room full for the rest of the day, but I want to make one observation that I think is important. The lesson, at least, that I've taken from all of these years was that during the time he was president of BU, John Silber was a nationally known figure. I used to be able to dine out on John Silber stories, of which there are a legion. Today, if you stand up in front of an academic audience and make a reference to John Silber, nobody knows who you're talking about, which is an extraordinarily good piece of instruction about the need for humility in life, and the notion somehow that with certain particularly historic figures known for greatness of one sort or another, both in the good and evil, most of us are going to be forgotten. So you better enjoy it and do what you can while you can.
So on that note, I would just say, thinking about your role as an individual but at an institution, I would love to hear thoughts on what kind of contribution you made. What was your stamp?
Dennis, go to it.
Well, I can end the comment with a Silber story too, so here we go.
I was prepared for Silber to be part of this conversation today.
I had been serving, and by the way, I spent 30 years at this institution. They were wonderful years. This was some of the happiest experiences that I've had in my 40-year career in higher education. And I found the dean's office, the staff, the faculty that would come and visit, the students that would come in office hours, just wonderful people to spend time with, very supportive. This is a very high-quality organization for a long period of time, and I'm so grateful for the years that I was able to spend here. So I had some experience. Yeah. I had some experience as head of the mathematics department when a new vice president for academic affairs was hired, with the mission, with the assignment of lifting up and building the College of Engineering, and he invited me to come to central administration as his associate for that work. So I had been spending a few years in central administration, and one weekend I was at Cape Cod with my family in a rainstorm, and the phone rang, and it was the president's secretary, and she said, he'd like to see you. I said, today? And she said, yes. And I said, Christine, it's raining cats and dogs, I'm on Cape Cod. And she said, I think you should come up. So I jumped in the car and I drove to Boston. And I found the president very irritated about some things that he wanted to talk to me about. And after I sort of wiggled my way through that conversation and was still in a thinking mood, he said, I have a couple of other things I want to check in with you on. Sure, what's that? He said, well, I'm getting ready to take a sabbatical leave, and I'm going to make the provost, who was John Wessling, the acting president. So I need an acting provost, and I'd like you to consider doing that. I said, well, okay, I'm honored, and I'll consider that. He said, good, then I have one more thing to check in with you about. What's that? He said, Dean Bannister in the College of Arts and Sciences has just announced that he will be leaving, so I'm going to need an acting dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. And he said, here's the issue. If you're the provost of the university, you can't trust the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences because he's got the biggest budgets and the strongest control of faculty. And if you're the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, you've got the provost on your back all the time about any kind of minutia that he wants to. So why don't you just do both jobs? So that's how it started. And turned out he was very supportive. And I was very interested in that arrangement because I was well aware there was a lot of tension between the college dean's office and the staff of the provost's office, who were pretty heavily into micromanaging everything that was going on. And that meant there were many, many issues flowing from the college up to the administration that weren't being dealt with expeditiously. So that was my real motivation. I thought, I can fix that, being on both ends of that correspondence. And I'm also reminded of a day when I first joined at Central Administration, and I was shown a closet full of boxes. And the boxes were filled with appointment papers for part-time faculty appointments that hadn't been responded to for like 6 weeks or something. And what I was told is just get a pen, go through this box, sign everything you find, don't read anything, just sign it. So I had an opportunity to solve some problems, and that was very attractive.
Well, these are some innovative solutions to the challenges of running a large institution. Dean Henderson, Dean Sclaroff, anything? Yes.
Well, I served as dean under Dennis as provost, and I can say also that when he was provost and dean, he used to overrule the dean on occasion, and I just wondered how you could do that. And, but Dennis could.
Well, it's a fairly long walk between the two offices.
Exactly.
You had time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you think like a provost, sometimes you can't think like a dean and vice versa. But I was lucky to inherit the staff Dennis mentioned. They didn't want to go up to the provost's office with him, so they stayed in the dean's office, and that was a godsend to me because they knew everything. They especially knew Dennis, so it's not that I could trick Dennis because he knew the college very well too, but I was glad to have staff that could bring me up to speed. My great joy in being dean was a continuation of my great joy being chair. I'd been chair of the department for 11 years before the dean and director of the college honors program, founding director of that. So I got to know everybody. And as you heard in the introduction, I taught at other R1 universities before I came here, and at several since as a visitor. And this is the most collegial university, students and faculty, that I've ever been at. And the minute I got here, I began to know people in other departments and other fields. We got to know people around the university. John Silber would call me up on Sunday morning and argue with me about Sophocles. I mean, he'd been reading something and it just had to be in his bonnet. He always called in my office too to see if I was there on Sunday morning, and he liked it that I was there. And with John Silber, the day I became dean, July 1st, 2002, was the day that John Silber came back to the presidency for 1 year. John Wessling had stepped aside, so I got to work with him as president, but years before that as chair. And you just have to love a university where the president can be interested in intellectual matters and be very concerned about appointments and come to talks. I would give a little seminar or something, and John would be there. And he would always ask the first question. It would be a killer question. And I didn't think he'd been listening because he was taking notes and talking to an assistant the whole time. Didn't seem to be listening to me. But he asked a question that was a killer, always. And I think I served as interim dean for one semester. They weren't sure that I could do the job. And I got into an argument with the chair of the economics department, who was a great favorite of John's. And he wrote me what I considered a nasty letter, so I wrote him an even nastier letter back. This isn't me, I'm not a nasty guy. But this really ticked me off, and my colleague Peter Doringer can attest to the fact that economists can be kind of testy. So the chair of the economics department went to John and showed him this letter from this insolent classicist who was pretending to be dean. Well, John loved this letter and said, that's right, that's what you need to do is really fight. I want some blood on the floor here. He just liked this argument. And so he gave us both what we wanted. And from that day on, I think he accepted that I could be a dean, but only if I fought with him. When you went to see John, you had to fight. Otherwise, he didn't think that you were serious. But it was great fun. And this is BU. This could only happen here.
Thank you for that. Dean Sclaroff, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the stage with all three of you. One of you hired me to Boston University in 1994. Another asked me to serve as department chair. Before I arrived at BU, I worked in industry as a programmer for 5 years before going to graduate school, and really felt the calling to work with students and to work in an academic environment. So when I came to BU, I had a liberal education. I was an English major, double with computer science. And through a series of lucky events, I had the opportunity to be the interim dean. At first, I was hesitant. But really what excites me most is opportunity to work with people and to see people, in terms of the mission of a university and a college, the multiplier effect of working with students and early career people and helping to be the champions of their careers and help to advance the overall school. It's something I discovered. I was hesitant actually to even consider being the permanent dean. And in fact, I was out hiking with my sister in the woods, and I got a call from the provost saying, "You haven't applied, why not?" And so I did. And I have to say the most exciting part of the job is looking at the promotion cases and the mid-tenure cases of all of the faculty and reading what the students write about our faculty, to read about what the people in the field say about our faculty, and having a year of that experience and working with such an excellent team that has the points that were made earlier about this progression of the university historically, where there were people in the office of the dean, people in the school who really contributed to an outstanding organizational structure. I think of, for instance, Susan Jackson as an example of a person. It's really, we're deans here on this stage, but I think we owe it to all of those people who were in those roles along the way, and the deans who preceded us who sort of paved the way, including Gina and Ann and others. But in terms of what motivates me and why I want to do it, it's really the intellectual smorgasbord and the excitement of supporting the trajectory of all these people, students, faculty, and staff.
Well, I love that I asked why you wanted this position, and it ended up being a conversation about the pleasures of the job, which anticipated my next question. So we've heard about BU as a political refuge, we've heard about the intellectual engagement, the collegiality, the collaboration that really characterizes CAS. Before we move on in the conversation, though, I do want to bring in Dean Sapiro and Cudd, who had specific reflections on the pleasures of the role. What were some of the pleasures of being Dean of CAS?
Yeah. Well, the biggest pleasure, of course, is meeting with so many different faculty and hearing about their stories and their research, reading through tenure and promotion files, which is one of the big jobs that a dean has to do, and making judgment calls about that. It's such a pleasure because, especially if you're a philosopher and curious about so many other methodologies and so many other disciplines, that it was a great pleasure just to read the files and try to, bring myself into the research of all of these different faculty. There were many other things. I mean, I really enjoyed being a part of the senior leadership team, the provost's cabinet, and meeting with the other deans. So many of the other deans were really great thought partners for me as well. So that was fun. And I used to even go running midday from my office on a 3-mile loop along the Charles, and that was certainly a great pleasure as well.
First and foremost, I loved being a student, and it meant I got to continue being a student. When you think of trying to run and manage the College of Arts and Sciences, with everything across the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, computational sciences, and all the in-betweens that run those together, and I had to make decisions about that all the time, it meant that I had to develop a certain amount of knowledge about all of that. Now, that is pretty scary, given my background, for example, as I'd look at a theoretical physicist who was trying to convince me we should or shouldn't do something, and I had to be able to ask the right questions and come to an answer that was reasonable. But it meant every day that I was in the CAS building, and for that matter, not here while I was dean, I learned stuff about every field. And I made sure that I had what I called the New York Times Digest knowledge about everything. I would just read superficially and voraciously because I could never make believe I was an art historian. I could never make believe I was a theoretical physicist or a statistician or a classicist. But I wanted to kind of know what was going on out there. I wanted to know what the issues were, and I wanted to have a basic vocabulary to know how to ask questions, and especially to know who to trust when I sought advice. So first, second, and third was learning all the time. Second was investing in careers. When I look around the college now and see the leadership, the scholarly leadership, the administrative leadership in the College of Arts and Sciences, I see all sorts of people I hired, I talked to people, I see all sorts of people who sat shaking in my office who were afraid of tenure, and I watch this garden having grown, and it does my heart good, because all of you will pass it on to the next generation and the next, and those are the ripples that go across time.
So I love those remarks, and I think they resonate with a lot of the comments that you made here today in wonderful ways. Moving on, I'd like to pivot a little bit and think about how all of your backgrounds, very different training, prepared you for this role. And once again here, I'd like to begin with Dean Sapiro and Cudd, and you'll see in Dean Sapiro's reflections on this question that her work within a women, gender, and sexuality studies program specifically prepared her for the role of being the first woman dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. So it's really worth spending some time with this footage.
My primary area is I'm a political psychologist. So that had a very deep influence on how I did leadership. First of all, I studied it, but I also started at the time when a bunch of us, crazily enough, invented women's studies. So it had a profound impact in having thought deeply about it and having come at it from a particular philosophical, theoretical, ethical point of view.
Following on that, You were the first woman dean of CAS. What was that experience like for you?
It was really funny because it was such a big, bloody deal to so many people. One person even put on his CV that he helped hire the first woman dean. So I've never been anything other than a woman, so whatever I've done was as a woman, and I happen to know that women are different. So what made a bigger difference was my training and the women's studies, the feminist part of it. I had a very particular interpretation of being a woman, and I didn't have any issues with making decisions. I had long since left behind the difficulty of speaking in public. I was one of those silent little mousy students, but I eventually had to learn how to speak in public. So being a woman in a way didn't make much difference to me, but to the people around me. The Reader's Digest anecdote was I was introduced at a big meeting that included alumni reception and so forth, and they made a big deal about me being the first woman. And I announced that I thought the absolutely best thing about being the first woman is nobody would ever have to go through that again. But one old dude came up to me, sorry about being ageist, I'm probably his age now, and he took one look at me and turned around to everybody else and said, "See, at BU we don't need affirmative action. We don't need affirmative action because we do this naturally." And, I had to put the smile on my face and not say everything that was in my mind about his assumptions, the fact that he looked at me and saw affirmative action, what he thought affirmative action was, what was wrong with it. And I just sort of said, yes, well, and turned to someone else. So that's what it was like.
I do think that being a philosopher is really perfect for being the dean of arts and sciences, in part because philosophers study all kinds of different ways of knowing, all kinds of different epistemologies, and they are interested in every other discipline, I would say. And so I was naturally curious about the methodologies and the content areas of all the different arts and sciences.
Okay, now I'm going to turn the floor over to the four of you. We have a computer scientist, mathematician, classicist, legal scholar. How did these backgrounds inform how you approached the role of dean?
Well, classics is a whole culture field, and it used to be the liberal arts. Classics was the liberal arts, philosophy, science, mathematics, literature, art, law, politics, oratory, all of it's in there. So it's intrinsically interdisciplinary, but it's also an unthreatening field. I had several chairs tell me that it's good to have a classicist as a dean because you won't be putting your thumb on the scale for any favorites, and that was kind of true. Yeah, I enjoyed working with and getting to know more about other people's fields.
Thank you. Other thoughts on your preparation for the role?
I was trained as a lawyer and had preceded the job by being an assistant to a congressman and then a cabinet officer in Washington. So I always had a slightly litigious and political perspective. My lens was not as benign, I think, as yours. And that probably served me well because I was dean during the Vietnam excitement, and it seems to me, as I look back on it, sort of a blood sport at the time. I was telling somebody earlier today about a visit from Howard Zinn to inform me that he was going to France to teach. We were about 2 weeks into the semester. And I said, "Howard, we're only 2 weeks into the semester." I said, "If you want a sabbatical for next year, I could probably advance your sabbatical clock, but you can't unilaterally tell me that you're going to France." "Oh," he said, I have this arrangement." And He said, I'm looking forward to it, and they're looking forward to having me. And he says, don't worry about it. He said, I've covered the class. And with somebody even more competent than I said, so I thought I'd flatter him. I'd say, well, that's impossible, Howard. And he said, no. He said, I've got Herbert Marcuse covering me for the class. I said, well, that's an interesting appointment for a one-day, guest lecture. But you can't just go away to France for the year and put Herbert Marcuse. You can't subcontract professoring. I said, listen, I said, here's the deal. Finish the semester and we can talk about next year, but tell these people you can't come and blame me if you want. No, he said, Stephen, I'm going to go. And I said, Howard, I'm going to fire your ass. And he said, you can't fire my. He says, I've got tenure. I said, well, it won't be a question of tenure. It's going to be breach of contract. I said, finish the semester. And he got up and told me to do an unnatural act and slammed his way out of the office, slamming the door. Years later, a student told me that he ran into Howard coming out of my office, and Howard said I wasn't such a bad guy, that I was being whipped into doing this by John Silver. We shouldn't tell all these John Silver stories, but they're so entertaining. Let me slide in here that I think Bob Brown did an extraordinary job, and I am a great administrator of the Boston University, and he was such a perfect successor to John, who actually cared about university administration in a very different way. But Silver taught me so many lessons that I can barely get them out. He was a great fan of black churches, black preachers. He'd show up on Sunday, get me to put on a coat and tie, and we'd go to Roxbury to church. And he would keep track of visiting preachers from other cities who were speaking in Boston. And I knew from church nothing, and black churches less. In fact, I was into negative numbers. And so we're in church, and they passed the plate. So I put $20 in the plate. And Silver sees that. And the plate gets to him, and he puts $5 in the plate. And then he leans over to me, and he passes the plate on. And he leans over to me, he said, Sonny, he said, you're going to learn something today. This is a 4-plate service. He said, you always come armed with a pocket full of 1s and 5s. He made a lot of mistakes, and they were as instructive in their own way, of course, as the things he did well. And later on, as president myself at both Hartford and later on at GW, I tried to avoid some of the more glaring mistakes that he made, one of which was you don't want to antagonize every constituency at the same time. He was a man who at the same time could have a fight going on with the faculty, the students, the alumni, the staff, and total strangers who were walking by. I'm taking too much time. I'm obviously enjoying myself in your company.
Well, I think we're getting a sense of how the Nixon administration prepared you for the work at Boston University. Would anyone else like to weigh in? We are still on this question of background preparing us for these roles.
I wanted to follow on with a Howard Zinn, John Silver. Howard Zinn came to see me in the office one day and said, Dennis, I think I'd like to retire. Would you be willing to speak with the president on my behalf so that I could have some kind of an arrangement to retire? And I said, I think he'd be interested in hearing about that conversation. What do you have in mind? And Howard produced a long piece of shelf paper where he had organized it into rows and columns. The rows were the years, and the columns were the things he wanted to have for him and his wife, and he had numbers in each of these things and so forth, and he rolled it up and handed it to me. So I went to see the president, and I said, I came to ask you if you would be interested in having Howard Zinn retire. He said, you're kidding. No. How does this happen? I said, well, he has a proposal here for what he would like to have for an early retirement plan. Laid it out on the desk. John got very interested in getting into each of these components of that piece of paper and would point out he'd be better off getting more here, he'd be better off doing there. And by the time we were done with that discussion, he had arranged for a much more generous retirement package for Howard Zinn than what Howard had asked for himself. And I thought that was a very interesting insight into John the human being and the ability to get beyond the conflict of the issue and do something for someone that was helpful. I, years later, saw Howard Zinn in Kenmore Square one day after he retired, just sort of sunning himself. He was such a handsome fellow. And I walked over and I said, Howard, how are you? You're looking very well. Are you happy? And he said, yes, I'm happy. And Dennis, you'll be happy too once you're retired from Boston University. My background was as a mathematician, and I was a very successful teacher. I won the Metcalf Cup and Prize as a junior faculty member, but I was always concerned about all the negativism around teaching and learning mathematics. And whether I was teaching 200 students or 20 students, it seemed to me the relationship that you develop with your students, there's a relationship of trust, and there is a relationship of how you engage them in the ideas and the developing concepts of your course that goes beyond what a lot of the contemporary concern is with get the sage off the stage and put the guide on the side and break the students down into little working groups. And it just makes me think of attending some of Elie Wiesel's lectures on Job's suffering in the core curriculum, an auditorium full of spellbound people. And the ability to listen to a lecture, to listen to a sermon, to listen to a political argument is an important part of the liberal arts experience. And that is something that I'm very proud of in the work that was done over the years in this college, especially by the development of the core curriculum and by what I observed with the examination of tenure candidates and promotion. I would always visit the class to observe the tenure candidate and realized how so many different types of teaching are brought by members of the faculty, so creatively, so passionately, that you can't break these things down into simple concepts. It's a very complicated set of relationships between faculty and students, and I think it's in the strong tradition of the College of Arts and Sciences that that's so very strong.
You're anticipating a question I wanted to ask next, but Dean Henderson, you
I
want
just wanted to follow up on that by pointing out that teaching is important in the College of Arts and Sciences and at Boston University in a way that you wouldn't see elsewhere. Before I came here, I was not allowed to teach undergraduates at Michigan or USC because I was a senior faculty member, and you didn't teach undergraduates. You taught graduate students at a reduced teaching load. But I like teaching undergraduates. I mean, I'm not a great teacher like Dennis, but I'm an enthusiastic one, and I love teaching. And I couldn't believe when I got here that they would let me do elementary courses and lecture courses again. It was so much fun. And that's a great strength of a university when the senior faculty have a responsibility for undergraduate education, and it helps the liberal arts ideal when you're in front of undergraduates, because you have to convince them and you have to guide them. They're not already experts. And often, because of our general education requirement, they're not in your class because they're particularly interested in it. So your challenge is to interest them, and by this process of getting to know them, you learn something too about how it all fits together. So it's a wonderful thing about our college, and if any of you had not been undergraduates at another college than BU, then that's something that you got that you wouldn't have gotten elsewhere.
Of course, yes, go ahead.
I just want to jump in and
Please.
and say that the assumptions about computer scientists are not true. Whatever assumptions you bring, it's a team sport, and a lot of the work that computer scientists do, especially in applied computer science, involves working across disciplines. So I've worked with psychologists, linguists, neuroscientists, and also worked with many students and many collaborators. And I think that also prepares you, this idea. And on top of that, a theme that seems to be going through this that's sort of under the hood, which is you learn as you go, you observe, you listen, and there's no one pivotal thing that leads to what prepares you. It's just that you're continually learning as part of this whole, being part of an academic enterprise. Well, I hate that word. As part of the academic mission of an institution, you really learn from being part of it.
It gets back to Dean Sapiro's points about this being a garden, right? Yeah.
Just one short follow-up to what I said before, this about collegiality. This economics chair, a very distinguished guy that I spent my whole deanship fighting with, I mean really fighting, and second only to John. After my deanship, a few years later, I was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I wondered who sponsored me. It has to be members. And I thought, well, I knew one classicist that did, but I wanted to know who the other classicists were. And I found out that he was one of the guys. Did you know that, Peter?
Yeah, I didn't know that. I'm surprised.
I was floored. I took him out to the Busy Bee for breakfast to thank him.
So we're starting to hear a lot about the arts and sciences. And as deans, in one way or another, you're all ambassadors for the arts and sciences. So we have about 10 minutes left to start thinking about that vision. And again, I'd like to begin with comments from Dean Sapiro and Cudd reflecting on the value of the arts and sciences in 2023.
I want to zoom out for a minute. As a dean, you're also an ambassador for the liberal arts, or the arts and sciences, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. How do you advocate for the liberal arts, and why does a liberal arts education matter in 2023?
Yeah, actually, that was certainly one of the best parts of the job, was to be able to be that champion for the liberal arts, to be a champion for the things that I've always found to be so helpful and enlightening in my life, in the humanities especially. I'm a humanist after all, I'm a philosopher, and I think that the humanities teaches us about different cultures, different perspectives. It teaches us critical thinking. It teaches us how to be human and how to create through language and through different ways of thinking about our world. And I think that's so essential if we're going to be a successful democratic society. We have to be able to empathize with others. We have to be able to see their perspective, but we also have to be able to take a critical lens to that and make sure that we are leading with ethics and integrity. And I think that arts and science education is really essential to be able to draw on lessons from the past, on lessons from others about how different people lead their lives.
I have a kind of classical view of the liberal arts and sciences with a difference. And the more I currently work on my history of higher education in the US, the more that becomes clear to me. An educated person has to have understand a breadth of ways of knowing, have a breadth of knowledge, but especially a breadth of ways of knowing, a depth in a limited number of fields, and a set of cognitive and discovery skills that's crucial. And so I think that breadth of knowledge, not expertise and everything, but a breadth of knowledge, creates a creative people in an era where we don't get a first job and keep it our whole career, but we create our jobs. Things change, so you have to move. You need that breadth of knowledge. And then finally, the liberal arts also has not what people used to just call the furniture, but the skills, the cognitive skills to be able to read, calculate, look up information, analyze information, and understand that you don't do that exactly the same way when you're trying to understand a historical problem versus a piece of architecture versus a pandemic versus a warm ocean.
Why do we need the liberal arts today?
So, being a Methodist institution, alcohol was not conventionally served on the campus. And another John Silver story. John Silver was offended by what he thought was the hypocrisy of that, because he said when he wandered around the campus, if he wandered into a faculty member's office, they would most congenially offer him a drink. And they would keep a bottle in their desk drawer, and they would take out 2 paper cups and a bottle, and they'd pour one for him and one for him. And he said to me, Trachtenberg, he said, we really ought to do something about that. He said, a good faculty club, he says, enhances collegiality. I said, yes. He said, why don't you look into this? So I look into it, and I go to see Dan Finn, who was then vice president of the University for Community Relations or something, and he had been a deputy mayor. And I tell the problem to Finn, and Finn says, well, what have you done so far? I said, well, I went to our law firm, and they want $25,000 to get us a liquor license. Oh, he said, I wouldn't use those white shoe guys for something like that. And he gives me the name of somebody downtown, a lawyer, a single practitioner who apparently specializes in liquor licenses. So I go to see this guy, and it's right out of a crime novel. He's got his feet up on the desk, he's got a hat on, he's wearing, and he's got one law book in the office, and that's the entire operation. And on the glass door in the front, it says lawyer. So I come in, and I tell him my story. He says to me, how did you get here? I said, Dan Finn sent me. Oh, he said, Dan Finn, okay. So he says, I can get you a liquor license. He says, but it's going to be $50,000. So I say to him, wait a second. I got this other firm. They want $25,000. He says, how's that going for you? I said, well, it's not working out, which is why I'm here. He said, I've got expenses they don't have. He got a liquor license in about a week. So that's instruction too, right? I mean, I learned things that helped me later on in my career about how things happen.
I have to say, this is not where I thought we were going to go with this question. But I'm game. Can we try to return to the liberal arts? Unless there's a connection between liberal arts and alcohol that...
This is the liberal arts, but these guys are real deans. I just wandered into the profession.
I had a story I wanted to tell that might help you with that. It's about a College of Arts and Sciences graduate that I got to know very well as dean, and it was a wonderful friendship. And it was about a man who grew up poor in Chelsea. His family sold used clothing. He had a scholarship to come to Boston University. He studied the liberal arts, got his degree, went into World War II. He was in the invasion on D-Day. He came home, and he decided what he wanted to do with his life is get very rich so he could support medical research and the health sciences. So that was his goal, to get rich. He had a liberal arts degree. His goal was to get rich. It wasn't what you're hearing today about our students concerned about how they're going to make. He knew what he wanted to do with his life. So he got a traineeship with Standard Oil Corporation as a management trainee and started working for Standard Oil and realized he was never going to get rich if he stayed on that track. So he resigned the position. He borrowed money from his brother to buy a gas station, did well in running the gas station, bought a few more gas stations, kept doing better and better, and finally formed a corporation called Extramart, which expanded up and down the East Coast. It was the model of a convenience store and a gas station. Made a lot of money and came to see me in the dean's office one day to introduce himself and explained the reason he was there. He had this goal to get rich and so forth, and he was an alumnus, and he wanted to know who he was. He explained he had been on the board of trustees, but he was a former trustee because he took the position that the president should deal with the academic issues of the university and the board of trustees should deal with the business aspects. And so that's how he became a former trustee. But he went on to make a $20 million naming gift to one of the buildings in the Harvard Medical Center on Longwood Avenue. He later made a naming gift for the Brown University Medical School. It is the Warren Alpert Medical School. And he also endowed a wing of one of the large hospitals in New York. And he died very rich and left all of his wealth, a bit to his family, but mostly to medical research. And I think that's a wonderful story of someone who started in the liberal arts, not in a business school, not in a technical field, but went by the motto of be good at your craft, support your people, and give something back. And I thought that was a wonderful lesson. I enjoyed getting to know him marvelously. It's the Warren Alpert Mall outside that has the rock on it, and there was $1 million gift in his estate to name that.
It's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it. Other thoughts before we conclude?
Conclude? Why would we conclude?
Continue the conversation in other venues.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a liberal arts graduate, I think we all are.
Yes.
There's a certain adaptability and nimbleness that comes from having that kind of an education. Certain way of being able to change approaches. You may not know all the different approaches. You only encounter some of them as a student. But what you do learn is how to learn new approaches and how to work with people who know other approaches to collaborate in solving a problem. And I think the complexity of the world really demands this.
and how to ask good questions too.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
It is, without wanting to provoke a fight right at the end here, it is troubling to me, and this is not a BU story, it's a national higher education issue, that the undergraduate degree in business administration has become the most popular undergraduate degree in the United States. It always seemed to me that business administration ought to be reserved for the master's degree. But both here and later at the University of Hartford and at George Washington University, I could not resist, even as president, the popularity and the pressure of undergraduate business degrees. And had I proposed doing away with them, somebody would have said, get a rope. So I didn't, because I valued my own life too much. But I think it's a real concern for the country going forward that enrollments are plummeting, partly as a result of demographics, and partly as a result of the alienation from America by higher education and the other way around, and that there's extraordinary change in the gender percentages in which there are, instead of having equality, what we've got is a predominance now of women going to college rather than men who are seeking their futures in other ways which do not require degrees. And we ought to hold another panel just on these topics because I think the future, not only of BU, but the nation and higher education is under extraordinary stresses at the present time.
It's a changing landscape, to be sure. I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions from the audience. Any questions? Yes.
I had a question that was more directed toward Dean Berkey, because when you were talking, should I stand up or wait? My question is for Dean Berkey. When you were talking, I think, about your mathematics background, my question was whether there might be a role for the movie Hidden Figures in the teaching of mathematics. That movie really impressed me with how, I think there was a statement in the movie somewhere, he says, where the woman says, math is always understandable. And he says, well, it is for you. And I thought that could inspire people in the STEM area, but also particularly in mathematics. I wonder if you might comment about that movie and perhaps its role in education.
Well, again, I think an important part of the role as a math teacher is interpreting what you're trying to do with the formalism in ways that students can grasp. You can draw a simple graph and connect with the words what's happening with the concept and with the formulas. And if you can make those connections, I think that's a big part of the success. I also used to enjoy to have students come up and volunteer to take the next step at the blackboard to see if they were following what I was doing, and they were often eager to do that. And I actually, at one point, announced that I was giving a particular student an A for the course, done, right there, for what he was able to do over the course of a couple of classes. And I think there's a very human relationship you can build between the mathematical concepts and the intellectual activity of trying to quantify and envision what we're actually doing. But it's a very human enterprise.
Thank you for that question. Other thoughts from the audience? Yes, please use the microphones.
Yeah, Dean Trachtenberg, you had alluded to your point about business administration, this tension that often occurs between the student demand for a particular curriculum and the faculty or administrators' views about that. I was curious to hear from all of you how you've attempted to navigate that challenge and if you have any particular preferences for how that should unfold.
I think they pay faculty and students do the paying, which makes, and I perceive the deans and professors as professionals. It's like going to a physician. I suppose you could go see your doctor and tell him what your diagnosis is and what you read on email with your computer, but it seems a little absurd to do that, not having spent medical school and internship and all that gives physicians some standing to speak. I think, that deans and professors who do not, in fact, use their maturity and their expertise to determine what the curriculum is and what ought to be included in the courses, however old-fashioned that may sound, are not living up to their responsibility. Frankly, I think most undergraduates don't, in fact, know what they know, and I've always been very critical, for example, of the curriculum of a place like Brown, which sort of says it's an open buffet. Well, life, in a manner of speaking, is an open buffet, but a little instruction helps you avoid some of the bumps. So I am a believer that universities should have, at the undergraduate level, a somewhat focused curriculum. And I've always been very fond of the one I experienced at Columbia, which had a core curriculum which commanded most of the freshman and sophomore year. And there's one at Yale as well. Now, I'm not sure everybody has to do that, but again, I'm not sure everybody needs to go to college. which I know goes against the American grain. I think 2 years of post-secondary education is probably appropriate. And I'm a great fan of community colleges, but there's a place, and Silver, I keep coming back to Silver, I guess it's the environment, was a great admirer of artisans and skilled people. Had tremendous respect for plumbers and electricians and people who made the world run, and did not believe that everybody needed the liberal arts education, but I think would have thought that everybody needed a taste and an ability to do one thing or another and still have some pleasure in music and books and the ability to walk out on a dark night and look at the sky and take some pleasure from it and have some knowledge of what they were looking at. So I think America got a little too carried away with the notion that everybody ought to stay in college, and then perverted it by saying, stay in school, you'll earn more. And we've made the test of the value of an undergraduate education your ability to become richer, come back to your man with the goal, rather than to lead an enhanced life, acknowledging, of course, that everybody has to earn a living as well.
Thank you for those comments that really play into the last question I posed as well. Well, sadly, we are out of time with this session. I think we could keep talking for hours, but I know we have lots of other events to get to. So I want to thank the panelists for joining us on stage today. It's been a real honor to hear your stories. And of course, I want to thank you for your service to the College of Arts and Sciences as well. It's tremendous what you've done for the college, and we all appreciate that. So let's give everyone a round of applause. And before parting, Dean Healy has some final remarks he'd like to make, so stay for that. Thank you.
Again, a big thank you to our moderator and our panelists. A big thank you to our audience members this morning. The fun does not end here. Of course, some of our panelists were kind enough to do a full in-depth interview over video. So if you want to go deeper down these rabbit holes, you will have the opportunity to do so. We will post all of this information, including today's presentation, online. So if you want to visit our website later down the line, we will have that available for you shortly. This afternoon, we have a wide range of things that you might want to consider, from the Favorite Poem Project to presentations and departmental showcases with chemistry and physics, what will apparently be a rainy walking tour. And this afternoon, of course, at 3:30, the Gittner Family Lecture with the topic of what does it mean to be human in the world of AI. So I hope you can join us for that. Again, a big thank you to you for joining us today, and of course, a big thank you for our panelists. Again, appreciate it.